So today's the day I dreaded for the longest time. I'm going to rank all 19 albums of one of my favorite bands ever. Top 5, hell, top 3 heavy metal bands of all time. The godfathers of metal, Black Sabbath. So yeah, it's no easy feat, and I'll tell ya, I am going to ruffle a few feathers, but that's what this is all about. There's really no rights or wrongs, so your mileage might vary, but this is going to be my ranking of all 19 albums. So hello everybody and welcome to a new video and welcome to my channel where we talk about everything music from death metal to Queen and everything in between. Today we're ranking all of Black Sabbath's albums all the way from the worst to the very best. So yeah, just very quickly, Black Sabbath is one of my favorite bands ever. So I actually enjoy listening to pretty much every album. The ones on the very bottom, I'm not going to say they're bad albums. It's just that I don't listen to them as much, or maybe I just don't find them as iconic or as influential as some of the other ones. But yeah, they're not bad albums at all. I mean, they're pretty awesome. Alright, so that being said, and in the interest of keeping this video short and to the point, let's get started, because there's 19 albums to go through. So let's start at the very bottom. And for the bottom slot, I'm actually probably going to surprise a lot of you, because I'm going to choose one of the original lineup albums, and that is from 1976, Technical Ecstasy, their 7th album. Now, like I said at the beginning of this video, it's actually not a bad album. It's just not an album I go back to very often. It's only got 8 songs and I really like You Won't Change Me, All Moving Parts Stand Still, and there's something to that song, It's Alright, which is sung by Bill Ward, the drummer. There's something about it that I just really like. It might just be the fact that it's just a different song from everything else on the album. Now, I really dislike that song Gypsy, which kind of sounds like the Rolling Stones' Sympathy for the Devil, at least in the percussion work. But yeah, not a big fan of that song. All in all though, it's not a bad album, but if you're thinking about getting into Black Sabbath, this is not an album I would recommend you start with. Next down the list, for number 18 we have 13, the last album on their vast discography. Now for this album, they actually decided to go back to the roots, and they kind of sound like they're ripping themselves off. I mean, a lot of the songs are inspired by the previous work, like you can listen to the first song, the beginning of the end, and it sounds a lot like their first song ever, Black Sabbath. Also Zeitgeist, it's a throwback to Planet Caravan and songs like that. But yeah, it's nothing we haven't heard before. It's just like, they're recycling riffs and stuff like that. They're recycling formulas. And you can tell they're trying to go back to the roots, but it kind of feels a little bit forced. So yeah. And I also dislike the fact that we almost have all of the original members. So we do have Ozzy Osbourne on vocals, we have Tony Iommi on guitars, Geezer Butler on bass, but guess who we have on drums? Let me give you a hint. His name starts with a B and his last name starts with a W. His first name has got 4 letters in it and his last name's got 4 letters in it. Bill Ward, you said? Brad Wilk. Come on, really? Anyway, my next pick is also going to be from the original lineup, and it's the 1978 album, Never Say Die. This album actually starts out pretty strong. I like the title track a lot. You've got Junior's Eyes, which is also a really cool song, and A Hard Road is also pretty cool. I don't really care much for the album cover, but it's not so bad. It's definitely not the worst they've done. But other than that, it's a pretty forgettable album. Again, not a bad album. It's not something I would jump off of my chair to just skip or even, eject out of the CD player. But, it's not something I necessarily think about playing all the time. In fact, the only times I do play it is because I think about the fact that I haven't played it in a long time. So I just go ahead and pop it in. But yeah, not something I come back to very often. Alright, so for number 16, an album I know you guys are expecting because it's not a fan favorite. This guy right here. Forbidden, and it is forbidden for a reason. This guy came out on 1995, and for the longest time it was the last album they put out. And I gotta tell you, it felt pretty weird because of the fact that you had Neil Murray on bass and you had Cozy Powell on drums. Also Tony Martin on vocals, highly underrated singer, and of course Tony Iommi on guitars. But it's a very different album. I mean, it's not something you would expect out of Black Sabbath. It's not a bad album. It's just yeah, it was a weird time for metal, I'll give you that. I do like The Illusion of Power, which is the opener to the album. I Won't Cry For You, which is the ballad of the album, and Guilty as Hell is pretty cool as well. Other than that, again, pretty forgettable. Next up, for number 15, we have their 1987 release, The Eternal Idol. This is the first album to actually feature Tony Martin on vocals, but you also got Jeff Nichols on keyboards, Eric Singer on drums, and Bob Daisley on bass, even though Dave Spitz was actually credited for recording the bass. Now, as far as the songs themselves go, The Shining is a great song, it's the opener to the album. I also really like Scarlet Pimpernel, and of course, the title track, Eternal Idol. Solid album. It gets overlooked a lot because of, the lineup, basically. Next up, we have a very different album with a very different artwork, to say the least. One of my least favorite album covers of all time, 1983's Born Again. For this album, we actually get Bill Ward on drums because he had left and he returns for this album. But other than that, even though we have Tony Iommi on guitars, obviously, and Geezer Butler on bass, you know, 3 of the original members, we get Ian Gillan on vocals, and it's a very different album from anything they have done before, even with Dio at this point. So yeah, I mean, cool album. You get Trash, which is like a very fast-paced, cool opener song. Zero the Hero, of course, is pretty good, and it was actually also covered by Cannibal Corpse, which, you know, it's an awesome song to cover and an awesome band to have a cover done by. Also, you get Born Again and Hotline, awesome songs as well. I really dislike the fact that, you know, you only get 9 songs and 2 of these are very long instrumental songs, and I really dislike Digital Bitch. I mean, for some reason, it rubs me the wrong way. It's kind of lame, to be honest. Now for number 13, a very solid album that actually surprised me to see it so low in the list. It's not that it's a bad album, it's just that I like the other 12 better than I like this. I mean, I keep coming back to those albums more than I do this guy, which is made by the original lineup. It's their 6th album from 1975, and it's Sabotage. This album, it's a really good album. I mean, I have no complaints about it. Now, of course, the best song on this album, if you ask me, is going to be Symptom of the Universe. And I really dislike Am I Going Insane, which seems to be the most popular song on this album, because it was the radio single and it's basically the more mainstream song on the album. But other than that, I mean, I don't mind listening to this album at all. I mean, I listen to it a lot, just not as much as I do the other 12 above it. For number 12, we actually have their 12th album, 7th Star. Now this album from 1986 actually has some sort of a weird story because it says Black Sabbath featuring Tony Iommi, but I mean, this is the only album that says that, and that is because of the fact that it was actually going to be released as a Tony Iommi solo album. But of course, the record label was like, dude, we gotta put the name on it. We gotta put Black Sabbath on it. It's going to sell more. And eventually he caved in, but he wasn't gonna. But yeah, it was not going to be a Black Sabbath album, and it shows. On this album, you get Tony Iommi on guitars, of course, as on every album. He was the only Black Sabbath member that was actually featured on every Black Sabbath album. But other than Tony Iommi, you get Dave Spitz on bass, Jeff Nichols on keyboards, you get Eric Singer on drums, and you get Glenn Hughes, one of my favorite singers, on vocals. Now, as far as the songs go, there's a lot of awesome tunes here. You get In for the Kill, No Stranger to Love, Turn to Stone is also really good, 7th Star, Danger Zone, In Memory. This is an awesome album, often overlooked because, you know, it's not technically Black Sabbath, but hey, it says Black Sabbath on it, so I'm counting it. And now for number 11, and it actually pains me to do this because it is a Dio album and I love Ronnie James, but I gotta give it to 1981's Mob Rules. Now this is a great album, and other than Ronnie James Dio being the vocalist for the album, we also get Vinny Appice on drums instead of Bill Ward. This is the first time Bill Ward left Black Sabbath. Now this is a very solid album. I mean, you get great songs, but if I had to choose my favorite songs from this album, they would have to be Turn Up the Night, Falling Off the Edge of a World, which is a totally underrated song, The Mob Rules, which is the title track, and my favorite song from this album, and one of my favorite songs in all of the Black Sabbath catalog, The Sign of the Southern Cross. Great performance by Dio there, and great songwriting. I mean, again, a great album. Alright, so finally we get to the top 10, and I know I'm going to surprise a hell of a lot of you, but my number 10 pick is going to be, however the hell you pronounce that, Tyr. For this album, you get Jeff Nichols on keyboards, which I don't think I've mentioned it, but, you know, rest in peace. Kelsey Powell on drums, also rest in peace. Tony Iommi on guitars, Tony Martin on vocals, and you get Bill Murray on bass. First album he recorded bass on for Black Sabbath. Now this guy came out in 1990, and it kind of shows. There's a shift in the recording quality. There's a different dynamic to the album itself, but you do get some great tracks on the album, like Anno Mundi, which is the opener track for the album. The Lawmaker is really good. Jerusalem is also really good. Valhalla is awesome, and Feels Good to Me is probably one of the better songs in the Black Sabbath catalog. Also another single, also another ballady type song that, you know, Tony Martin just did so well. Alright, for number 9, another Tony Martin album. This guy is from 1994 and is Cross Purposes. For this album, we actually get Bobby Rondinelli on drums, and this album marks the return of Tony Martin on vocals. He had left for a little bit, case you didn't remember that. It's actually one of the first albums I've heard without Ozzy Osbourne on Black Sabbath. So I was actually surprised at the shift in musicianship and, just the whole dynamic of the band. It just feels a lot different than the first, 6, 7, 8 albums. But you do get some awesome tracks. You get Eyewitness, which is a really cool opener. You also get Dying for Love, which is kind of a slow song on the album. The Hand That Rocks the Cradle is also a really cool song. Immaculate Deception is an awesome song with really cool lyrics. And my favorite song on this album has got to be Cross of Thorns, which is a really cool sort of ballady song that gets heavy at one point. Really cool album and a great vocal performance by Tony Martin. Alright, so for number 8, and I gotta tell you, for this next 4, you can actually just shuffle them in any order really, and it would be the same. It probably changes. If you ask me tomorrow, it'll probably be different, to be honest. But for the number 8 spot, at least for today, we have 1973's Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. I mean, what can I say about this album? This is their 5th release. It was released in 1973. Original lineup. So, of course, Tony Iommi on guitars, Bill Ward on drums, Geezer Butler on bass, and Ozzy Osbourne on vocals. Solid album. It sounds heavy. It's got one of the heaviest fucking riffs in all of heavy metal, which is that very doomy title track. That break towards the middle. Man, oh man. That is a juggernaut of a riff. But you also get songs like Fluff and Spiral Architect, which are really cool songs. Other than that, I am actually kind of sick of Sabracadabra because, ever since it got covered by Metallica, everybody was playing it. But I mean, other than that, every other song on this album is pretty goddamn killer. Oof. For lucky number 7, I know I'm going to get a lot of shit for this. I know a lot of you are going to be complaining in the comment section saying, hey, it should have been higher, it should have been higher. And I would tend to agree. It's just an album I've listened to so much. I mean, look at this. This album has been around the block quite a few times. And of course, I'm talking about 1970s Paranoid, their second album. And I've listened to the shit out of this album. So yeah, I mean, I'm actually kind of sick of some of the songs. But I'll tell you, War Pigs, Planet Caravan, Various War Boots, killer tracks, man. And for 1970, this is awesome. I mean, the production quality, if you compare this to their first album, it's just like, although I do prefer obviously the first album because it hasn't come up yet, but I mean, it's just, this changed everything. Now, out of the only 8 songs on this album, I am pretty sick and tired of listening to Iron Man and Paranoid, the title track, mainly because of the radio and because of the fact that they're simple songs. But this is a classic album. It's a great album. Great album. For number 6, Master of Reality. From 1971, all the way from that first cough at the beginning of the album, all the way down to the very last sound coming out of Into the Void. This is a great album. Definitely one of the best albums that ever came out of any studio. Really. You got Sweet Leaf, After Forever, Children of the Grave, Orchid, Solitude, Into the Void. Hell of an album. Alright, and so finally we get to the top 5, and now it's getting harder and harder to choose. And my number 5 spot goes out to Volume 4. Now here's the deal with Volume 4. I am actually not sick of any of the songs because they never play any of them on the radio, so that's a big plus. And I gotta tell you, I do listen to the radio a lot. People are complaining about that. They go like, you shouldn't be judging songs because they're being played on the radio. Who listens to the radio anyway? But I gotta tell you, I do. Every time I'm driving, I'm just listening to the radio. Sometimes it's CDs, sometimes it's the radio. And yeah, there's a lot of things that are overplayed by Black Sabbath. But this album has none of it. And there's some really great songs here. You get Wheels of Confusion, of course, Tomorrow's Dream, Changes, Supernaut, Snowblind, Laguna Sunrise, which is a really cool song. And it's a very different, very psychedelic, very progressive album. A departure from the first 3. So, they're taking a step out of their comfort zone if they ever had one. This album is really cool. Alright, so for number 4, we take it all the way back to 1989 and we get another Tony Martin album, which I gotta tell you, I love his work on Black Sabbath. And that album is, of course, Hellish Cross. An amazing, very heavy album. Now, this is definitely not a doomy album like, the first Black Sabbath albums. It's very dynamic, sort of fast-paced. It's very 80s, but it's awesome nonetheless. On this album, you get Cozy Powell on drums, and you also get Lawrence Cuttle on bass as a guest. I don't even remember if he's actually credited on the album, but he is there. There is bass on it, and he recorded it. Now, speaking of guests, On one of the songs on this album, you actually get the one guitar player that played on a Black Sabbath album other than Tony Iommi, and that is Brian Harold May, my favorite guitar player ever. And he plays the solo on the third song on the album, When Death Calls, which is one of my favorite songs on the album, obviously. But the title track, Hellless Cross, is also awesome. Devil and Daughter is pretty cool too. And the dark horse on this album is Nightwing, the last song on the album, which is a perfect closer. A great album. Alright, so we're finally getting to the podium, the top 3. If you're enjoying this list so far, please drop me a like and drop me a comment in the comment section down below. And let me know, which albums do you think should be on the top 3? Which ones do you think I underrated? Which ones do you think I overplayed? Let me know in the comment section below. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel like a man if you haven't yet. And if you enjoy the content and you want to help support the channel big time, please consider becoming a patron to the channel. A little goes a long way and we surely do appreciate it. For as little as $2.99 a month, you help the channel out tremendously. Alright, so we finally make it to the podium, the top 3. And I gotta tell you, this was a very hard choice. I was actually surprised to see that out of my top 3, 2 of the albums were actually recorded by Ronnie James Dio. But then again, not really. I mean, he is a great vocalist, so that shouldn't be that surprising. Now, for my number 3 spot, I actually chose 1992's Dehumanizer, which is an awesome album. And if you asked me like a year or 2 ago, it would have probably been in the top 2 or maybe even just the top. But honestly, I've listened to this album so much that right now I would have to, maybe as far as listening to it goes, ranking number 5, number 6, maybe even 7, because I don't listen to it as much because I overplay the hell out of it. But it's a great album nonetheless, and it had such an impact on me as a fan that it had to be up here. Now on this album, of course, we have Dio as a vocalist, but we also get the return of Geezer Butler as the bass player, and we got Vinny Appice on drums. So it's a really cool lineup, and out of that lineup, we get some awesome songs. Like some of my favorites on this album are Computer God and Too Late and Time Machine. But my very favorite songs on this album are going to have to be TV Crimes and I. Great songs. Great album. So now, of course, we get to the top 2, and I'm just going to reveal them together, because I mean, what's the point? But I gotta tell you, this was a very hard choice, because I mean, one of them was just so iconic and influential that obviously had to make it all the way up to the top. But the other one has like no bad songs, and every song is almost a 10 out of 10, and you get a great vocal performance, you get awesome solos, you get probably the best production out of all of these albums. So it also deserves to be all the way up in the top. So really hard choice for me to make, but I'm gonna have to go with, for number 2, 1980's Heaven and Hell, and of course our number 1 self-titled debut album, Black Sabbath. None other album was so influential for heavy metal as this guy right here. That's why he takes the number 1 spot. But let me redeem this album and tell you that, you know, after Never Say Die, this was a welcome change in everything. I love every song on this album. First album to feature Ronnie James Dio as a Black Sabbath member, and you get killer, amazing performances and songs such as title track Heaven and Hell, of course Neon Nights and Children of the Sea, which is an amazing song, and my very favorite song from this album, Die Young. An amazing album. But it is what it is. You listen to that first minute of this album and you're hooked for life. All you gotta do is just sit there in a dark room, hit play, and listen to the wind, the rain, the thunder, the bells, and that first riff. Just G an octave higher, and C sharp, that diminished fifth that sounds evil and awesome. I mean, really, you can't beat it. So yeah, my number 1 spot goes out to this album right here. Awesome songs, of course, the title track, NIB, The Wizard. I mean, every song here is awesome. Sleeping Village, front to back, a great album. Anyway guys, I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please drop me a like if you did, drop me a comment in the comment section down below. Drop me your list. I would love to read some lists in the comment section. I'll see you guys next time. Pat out, metal on, dudes.